Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Launches I've Loved. Today I have the privilege of speaking to Ravi Tharisayi, who is the Senior Director of Product Marketing at LaunchDarkly. And he's joining us. Hi Ravi, how are you?
Hi Jake, I'm good. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks so much for joining us. Really, the goal here is just to have a really informal conversation about your career in product marketing and sort of anchor the conversation around one particular launch that led in your career and why it was so memorable, what sticks out to you about it. And we're really big on two things here at Launch Notes. Always be celebrating is one of our values. So making sure that we stop and celebrate all the progress that's being made before rushing to the next thing because we're always so busy. And then the second thing, which I know you guys think a lot about too at LaunchDarkly, is transparency. We're big on transparency and letting people see into the window into what you're doing in your product development lifecycle. And so in that spirit, I want to have a conversation that both celebrates the launch that you've been a part of that you want to highlight, and then also to transparently talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly, and what you learned, because I think there's a lot of learning still to be had, and folks in product marketing and product management are just hungry. So super excited to chat, and I'll stop yakking now and give you a minute to introduce yourself and give us a little bit of your background and then what you're currently working on at LaunchDarkly.
Sounds great. Yeah. So for me, like you mentioned, I'm at LaunchDarkly now. I've been there for about a year. Previously, I was at Atlassian where I was head of product marketing for Jira Service Management. I'm going to talk about that launch in a bit. But actually, I started my career as a developer. So, graduated computer science, was hands-on keyboard coding for a number of years before I went to business school, and then ended up being at IBM. Really got a chance to work in some different roles there, from consulting to competitive intelligence and product marketing, and then went to New Relic for a 3-year stint there. So, I've been around the tech space for a while, both as a practitioner and now leading in product marketing. I think for me, product marketing is a really exciting role, and it's been awesome to see how this role continues to evolve in just the current landscape of software and where tech is going. But I think for me, what makes me most passionate about it is this intersection of, at a place like LaunchDarkly, helping developers understand ways of working, but also thinking about messaging and how to articulate that to such a wide set of personas that may be involved in that buying process and involved in that shift, oftentimes a mental shift in terms of how software works and how to ship great software. So, I'm really excited about what we're doing at LaunchDarkly and where things are heading. So that's a bit about me.
Terrific. Yeah, that's a great background, and I'm curious too, since you brought it up, and I always find that asking product marketers how they stumbled into the craft, because usually people have a winding way in. Talk a little bit about, if you will, just your transition from the development side of the house to the product and marketing side of the house, and what drew you over there.
Yep. Well, like I mentioned, I had moved into management consulting out of business school, and one of the things I enjoyed about that was working on very high-profile projects. But it was this thing where you moved from client to client. You never really got to see the thing that you envisioned really implemented, or were moving from project to project. And as I looked at post-consulting careers, I always had this aspiration of really being able to stick with something for a longer period of time, being able to think about both the strategy of that thing, but also really driving the execution. And that's how I got curious about product marketing. And I think it's delivered in a lot of those ways, where it's thinking about where you want to take strategically, but then also being good about orchestrating and executing on that vision. And so it's been, for me, I think, a good mix of those skill sets that really attracted me to it. I will say too that even when I was a developer, I always had this aspiration to find roles that helped people that were like me, that were developers, to do their job better. And I think part of what I've looked for is roles that are in product marketing, but help people that were like me, that were looking at new ways of development, struggling to figure them out.
Yep. Yeah, it's terrific. You're at the intersection of a lot of things in product marketing, especially working for a developer tool company and still getting to sell the persona where you started. So that's very cool. Which leads us to Jira Service Management as well, which also plays in that same IT space. And yeah, would love to hear a little bit about your time working on Jira Service Desk and Jira Service Management, and then tell us about that launch. It's so memorable for you as you think back of all the things that you've released and all the launches you've been a part of in your time as a product marketer.
Yeah, sure. And I think the interesting thing about that stint, I joined, the product was called Jira Service Desk. And, I think strategically, as we thought about the direction of that product, in the IT, there are very different connotations between Service Desk and what's called IT Service Management. And as we thought strategically about where the product was heading, we really wanted to look to position the product more as an IT service management product. And certainly from a product perspective, we had been releasing new update furthered the functionality that made it more competitive with other IT service management products in the market. But we hit this point where we really needed to shift in terms of the brand. And the brand was really viewed as a blocker to really taking that next step in terms of positioning the product as a IT service management solution. When your product is called Jira Service Desk, it's just always going to be viewed as a service desk. And so, we hit this point towards the end of 2020 where we wanted to make a big announcement, announce Jira Service Management, along with a number of product updates as well, including the bundling of an acquired product called Opsgenie that was also included as what we were going to rebrand as Jira Service Management. And I think one of the most fun things about that was we attached this brand campaign, and thinking about branding relative to a launch was something that I hadn't done before. And there's a lot of considerations there. Contextually, we were certainly a challenger in this space. Everyone's familiar with ServiceNow, and they're the 800-pound gorilla in the IT service management space. And so from a product marketing perspective, thinking about that challenge of launching a product that is competitive with other players that have been around in this space potentially for decades is a really interesting challenge. And it sort of spurred us to think a lot about what was the persona in our brand that we wanted to convey. And I'm really happy with the brand campaign that we came up with, and I'll chat more about that. But it was this thing of not only launching functionality, but really also launching this brand, and a brand that people could recognize and distinguish from other players that have been in the market for decades. So I'll just pause there and see any comments or reactions on that.
Yeah, that's terrific. It's so many questions. I'm curious how if you could chat about, like, because the brand there's the brand element, there's the product element, and then there's like the features and functionality, different levels. I'm curious about as you planned the launch, because there's just so many components that go into each. How did you think about that prioritization? How long did it take? What was driving was one driving the other? Or were they all being done in parallel? And what was that process like? Because I find the whole layering on the brand stuff is just it's a fascinating conversation just for any launch. But yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is leading up to that, I alluded to the fact that we had been adding more functionality that was getting closer to this IT service management space. And I think each of those launches gives us a bit of a canary test, let's say, a bit of a test to explore what's the right tone, the right message, what's resonating, what's not resonating. And, I'd say a good, 9 months leading up to that major launch, we had been releasing new capabilities, some of them even in early access, but each one of those, I think, gave us a chance to learn and tune and think about what's the right approach. And I think that was a really important element to being successful in the end, was looking for those opportunities leading up to a launch like that, to look for signals in the market and customer feedback that we could incorporate and evolve into our broader story. An example is early access to integration with Atlassian's Bitbucket product. And again, I think just that work of figuring out how to talk about that functionality gave us a chance to learn. We tested with customers, other subject matter experts, and learned a ton in that process that gave us the foundations of what our ultimate message would be, and then how to think about just the overall as part of that. So I really feel like that was the foundation, was using those 9 months, 12 months in advance to continually learn and optimize from those initial launches, and then using those learnings to think big about the brand and how to position the brand from there.
Yeah, no, I love that. It's not, and you and I were talking right before we chatted or started the interview about just the importance of thinking about launches and releases as a continuum versus a moment in time. And so it sounds like a lot of the things you were doing up into the moment of Jira Work Management was just steps along that continuum, as well as learnings that guided you to a moment in time where you went all in, which is such a neat approach, and something we had to do on the other Jira products as well over the years. Yep. So what is this is the hairy question I think most PMMs get on launches, but curious, like, talk us through, especially for something again that large and that had a huge brand component, like how did you guys think about success? What did success look like? How did you measure it? And again, how did that tie to the different layers of the launch itself?
Yeah, and I think layers is a good way to think about it. Certainly one of the biggest pain points that we had was when it came to customers considering IT service management products. Jira is not the first thing that you think about in that in that lens. And so, the brand aspect to this was very important. And so some of the things that we were looking at were search volume around the new product. So, we had been tracking for quite some time around Jira Service Desk searches, and we were curious to see that transition in terms of Jira Service Desk to Jira Service Management, and how quickly could we ensure that search traffic is starting to transition as an indicator that people are aware of this new brand and what it. Obviously, we're looking at trials and how often are people curious enough to actually try the product, and so looking across the funnel to see, are we pulling in traffic effectively? Are we getting people to try the product? And then definitely looking at adoption, and particularly I was alluding to some of those new functionality areas. We had been known as a service desk. We wanted to see where people adopt areas of the product that were aligned with some of the IT service management capabilities as another indicator that our pivot was successful. So, again, I think those are some of the layers, brand, funnel, and then product adoption to give us indicators if we were successful in this pivot. And I think what's interesting about that is that that's not like, you do the launch and you're done with those. That's a long journey, and especially when it comes to something with brand, you look and see how it went with the launch, but it's a never-ending journey as well. So I think that's one of the interesting nuances about something like that.
Yeah, totally. So switching gears here, how did you, another thing that we often talk to and see product marketers and product management in our community, discussing is the relationship between PM and PMM. Obviously, having worked at Atlassian, I know that it's quite a distributed global team, and I know on a launch especially, it's like that alignment's so important. I'm curious if you can take us into that a little bit and just talk about how you thought about, both from the Jira Service Desk side and then the Jira Management side, aligning PMM and PM, and what went well there and what didn't, and how did that impact the launch?
Yeah, well, I think I've had quite a few tours of duty on this in terms of and seen a lot of things in terms of that alignment. I think for me the thing that sticks with me is, and I guess it gets back to what we were saying earlier about product marketing having a strategy element and an execution element. And for me, I think times where friction emerges between product marketing and product management is a lack of alignment on just that starting strategy. What are we trying to do? What's the objectives we're trying to hit at? I think at times, people can see the tactics that product marketing is doing, but if it's not connected to a why are we doing this, it just gets hard to buy into that. And so I think one of the principles that, I think a lot about is being open and transparent with the strategy that we're thinking for product marketing, the trade-offs that we're making, the tough trade-offs that we're making, and aligning with product around those trade-offs. And then as you move into execution around that, I think you have a much better chance of success. People can understand why you're doing that tactic and not this other tactic. Well, it's because we talked about the strategy in advance. So I think for me, that element is really important. The other one that I put a lot of emphasis, I think, especially in this space that I am in, which is, around developer tools, is one of the toughest challenges for product marketing is knowing the audience when you're not technical. It's pretty intimidating to be able to write messaging and copy for an audience that is so technical. And I think on the product marketing side, we have to, I think, work even just that little bit harder to make sure that we know the product well, that we know the audience well, the issues that they're facing, and that we are credible when talking with product around those issues, that we've done our homework on some of that. And I think when that has happened, I think the collaboration with product gets a lot better when there's a common understanding of what the issues are for the customer, what our product can do, and some of the things that we're going to bring to the table to make that successful. So I think those are a couple principles that I think a lot about. They're tough. It's not like it's just a magic wand and it's easy. I think that's why it's hard. But I think thinking about those and being cognizant about those for me is helped to having a better chance at success.
Okay. Yeah, it's all super helpful, and I think great thoughts. A follow up on that, and again, thinking back, or even you could chat about how it is at LaunchDarkly, but also on the Jira Work Management side. I'm curious how, just having a conversation with a PMM yesterday who was building out her team for the first time and asking how do I think about who to hire when, and then how to align them to people across the org. Curious how you approach that, having again been in the PMM leadership role multiple times now. how do you think about building out your org and then aligning it with product, especially again around, like, I find that usually it's times when you're preparing for something big that those kind of those decisions and that alignment always breaks. And so I think something that ensuring that those communication lines are open is so critical. So just curious how you have approached that and what you've seen and what you've learned from that in your career.
Yep. Well, I think one of the interesting things about, and what I love about product marketing, is this intersection in the work of product marketing across so many different stakeholders in the business. And obviously there's that relationship with product, but also the relationship with sales. And, I think a critical aspect to building out your org is being aligned and thoughtful about aligning your priorities with the priorities of the stakeholders that you're supporting, whether that's product, sales, and other relevant stakeholders that you may be interested in supporting. And again, I think that for me is a critical element. Speaking with those stakeholders, understanding their priority, building up your own priorities, and then, building out the org are some of the tactical elements to support that prioritization or that strategy. So I guess I'm coming back to this strategy element, but again, I think that is such a critical element. Not saying that that's 80% of the job, but it's an important part of the job. It's a high leverage part of the job because it allows you to align with so many stakeholders across the org. And then again, when you get to building your org, it's aligned with some forcing function or some framework for thinking about where you want to invest in and who you're supporting and what you're trying to influence as part of that. And then I think the metrics and things of that nature all flow from that, the job descriptions, the goals, all of that flows from that. But I think, thinking upfront about that, at least a little bit, I think is critical.
Okay. Taking that one step further, again, this is a conversation I was just having this weekend with someone. Curious your thoughts on, does demand generation live underneath product marketing or beside product marketing or somewhere else entirely?
For us,
Robbie's hot take on this.
Yeah, I think in general, it's beside product marketing. Obviously, the collaboration there is really close. I think a lot about campaigns and how to run campaigns. I think campaigns is probably the biggest intersection between product marketing and demand gen, and I think plenty of discussion around where that should live and who owns that. I think for me, I've seen it in both sides of the world. I do feel like product marketing has to be really tightly intertwined with campaigns. That's thinking about the buyer journey, the messaging, and the assets that really allow us to tell the right story at the right time to customers and allows demand gen to really be clear and authentic at every stage in the buyer. And I think that's an important handoff to make sure it's successful when product marketing and demand gen are separate. So I understand that that's a polarizing topic. I can definitely see that, but I think that's it. For me, I found that to be a logical organization of skill sets to have them separate.
Yep, joined at the hip, especially when you're doing anything campaign related.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Yep. Great. We're already almost at 25 minutes here. The time's flying by. Want to get into, Robbie, with you specifically because I think from your time at IBM, New Relic, Atlassian, you've worked on some really big, what I would call tier one, big splashy type launches. However, I know obviously you're working at LaunchDarkly now. There's a lot of the way you guys are thinking about and even what LaunchDarkly stands for, more continuous new features and functionality and rolling things out in a more continual manner versus, again, the big Steve Jobs iPhone reveal, I always call it. So curious to just hear your thoughts on that evolution in the software market and why it's so important that companies do one or the other, potentially do both. Again, curious to get your thoughts, having seen and lived through so much of that change.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was interesting thinking about this interview and launches and thinking about how things have shifted. We're in this world now of SaaS and continuous delivery. And I think of a lot of customers that are using our product, LaunchDarkly. And, from a product marketing perspective, it actually creates some really interesting challenges where increasingly customers are moving towards smaller launches, smaller batch sizes. I alluded to the fact even in the Jira Service Management launch, there was that big announcement, but there was a lot of smaller launches that led up to that, and EAPs and betas and all these little things that give us a chance to get customer feedback. And I really feel like, at least from my experience, that seems to be the trend of where things are going, where you're iteratively testing new things, getting feedback on it, and then expanding upon it. And I think from a product marketing perspective, that creates some really interesting challenges where you're trying to explore how to create an ongoing communication with customers. It's not just a one-time launch and then you check in back with them in 6 months for your next launch. You're really trying to think about cadences that customers can follow and ways for them to keep up with all of these small little. And so, I think it creates emphasis around, those communication, those feedback cycles, and really also being clear and consistent every time around what's your bigger vision? How does this small thing that
Yes.
seems so insignificant, how does it connect to something bigger that I might care about, or how does it connect with other things that you're working on? So, I think it's a really interesting time to be in product marketing, just given the velocity and this shift to smaller releases. And I think it creates opportunities to rethink how we think about launches and just the overall approach.
Yes. Yeah, I could not agree more. One of the reasons and things we're trying to work with teams using launch notes on is rethinking that entire paradigm. There's still so much of product marketing that still thinks and works in a waterfall world, while the rest of the organization's over here working in a CI/CD world and a feature
Yep.
flagging world. What is as you guys talk to customers now, especially folks that are really invested in feature? I've always thought about there's two different types of release cadences: time based and then there's tiered based. So you can either say we're trying to do one thing a month, or
Mm-hmm.
we're trying to do a tier one thing and a tier two thing and a tier three thing. How have you guys thought about that? What do you recommend to customers? What have you seen work well in your own career?
Yeah, I mean, I think with a product like ours, we're working a lot with customers that are buying into this thought process around, more iterative development, smaller batch sizes, chances. Every time you get something out into the hands of customers, that gives you a chance to understand whether that thing is performing as expected, getting the right reception that you were expecting, and definitely I think that's where we see things heading is that notion. And I think what's interesting is that principle can be applied in multiple dimensions. We also have customers that are optimizing just their tech stack, whether maybe they're moving to the cloud or different AWS services, and using things like feature flags to test incrementally those updates before testing
Mm.
with all of their users. And so, I think it's a powerful principle, and I think when customers start getting used to that, it's just really powerful. It gives you a sense of confidence to get earlier
Yes.
feedback, get faster feedback, iterate faster, and realize that vision of Agile, which was, a very aspirational thing when I was, and I think things like feature flagging are really helping customers to get to a practical place of actually realizing that in a practical way. So, I think that's definitely, what I'm seeing a lot. I think from a product marketing perspective, I think like we've talked about, it just puts a little bit more emphasis on, the messaging, that it connects to bigger things, and that there are
Mhm.
ways for customers to follow all of these little things that are coming up. Again, I think I see more and more early access betas, and I think that's all enabled by things like feature flagging that allow you to do that. But I think on the product marketing side, you just have to be thoughtful about how to position that effectively and talk about all these different
Yes.
features that are in different phases in terms of where they are with customers.
Yeah, as you're talking about this, I'm almost thinking we need to introduce another one. I always think about them as like time based or tiered, and there's like a third that's like testing based, where you're constantly testing, seeing what works, rolling it out as you learn and iterate, and it's not necessarily related to a tier or specific time frame you're trying to hit. So I love that, and it also fits into a very nice
There
alliteration.
you
So
go.
we'll see about maybe maybe we can add a template into launch notes that addresses that. Robbie, we're already I think at time or even over time, but really enjoyed the conversation. One final question for you. Curious, is there one tactic that's your go-to tactic, or a secret weapon that you always use, or that you think is particularly powerful on big launches, and that you're like, I always need to make sure at least this is done because this is going to crush for me.
Well, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily game changing, but you and I have talked about, this notion of cadences, and, I am at this point a believer in, whether it's quarterly cadences or something along those lines where you're making larger go-to-market pushes and giving customers a chance to catch up on all of the product updates that have happened over a certain period of time. And in my experience, I've found that customers find that easier to follow. They start to follow a cadence in terms of when to check in on some of the updates. And so, certainly you're continuing to release new capabilities all the time. And like we've talked about, oftentimes they're small or in different phases. But I think having this cadence, I feel like, has been helpful. And what I found is helpful, particularly, is it's helpful not only for customers to follow, but also for your internal stakeholders to follow. I mean, it's amazing how challenging it is to keep up on product updates even internally, and having some cadence around enablement, around education, around updates, I think has been helpful in my experience. And I'll be curious, and we'll be curious to see what other product marketing leaders are adopting. But I think for me, that's been helpful, a simple, helpful way of thinking about it.
Thanks for listening to this edition of Launches I've Loved. For additional insights and best practices from the world's best product and marketing leaders, and to join in the conversation yourself, head over to our Launch Awesome Slack community. Sign up for free today at launchnotes.com/launch-awesome.